I'm a program director with Recycling Connections. I'm very excited to talk compost. Here where I'm at, it's a very cold, windy, sleety, rainy day. So it's a funny day to talk compost, but it's also Earth Week. And so I've already gotten started thinking about all the great things I have planned for my garden this year. I've got some starters going, and compost is an essential piece of that spring. With the presentation today, you could use the chat box. I will be taking some questions there. It is just me, so I'm monitoring both the crowd and presenting. So bear with me as we go through. What you can expect in this presentation today, I had some questions that I asked you as a sign up, and in that response, we had the majority of us are beginners or some experience, some intermediate, and a few of you are more above average. You mentioned my experience with composting is pretty extensive. I am an active composter in my backyard. This is actually an image of a setup one year with a couple enclosed, and then I have some curing piles. This is mostly leaf piles. It looks a little prettier today, but this picture was a couple years ago from now. So we also have folks that are coming in from 4 different states, which was exciting to see. There were 75 people that signed up to either watch live and have this conversation today, or to get the recording. So we are recording this for those that cannot attend live but still want the information. We will not be talking about any mid-scale composting, industrial composting, or anything like that. I know there were some questions on composting throughout the winter, and we do have a really nice tutorial on our website about that you could watch. We probably won't get too much into it tonight. But if that is of interest, there is some information that is out there that will allow us to get, so you can get that information of how to keep continuing composting even through the winter months, especially those of you and all of us on the call that are in kind of the northern section of the states. To start off, we're going to back up a little bit of looking at just waste in the country. EPA has put out these graphs, and I think I just wanted to point out a few things about it. First of all, our per capita waste production is at 4.9 pounds per person per day. That is quite high, and this doesn't even include the COVID numbers, which we haven't seen the data yet from EPA on that. We're expecting it did go up. We might have gone over the 5 pounds per day per person. Despite all the efforts we have for diverting waste from recycling and composting, the compost here you see is mostly yard material that municipalities are now collecting, or some states have bans of yard material in the landfill. So we've been able to keep this plateau of the landfills kind of growing. And then I'm going to zoom in a little bit on this particular piece, because that's what is that relates to us tonight. This little triangle, when you zoom in even further, it's the food waste. So EPA is now starting to keep data on how much food waste is actually getting composted or diverted from landfill. And we have a goal nationwide of food diversion to be 50% by 2030. And this is following a lot of climate goals that you probably have seen in the news. EPA has a lot of targets for 2030. And when it comes to waste and recycling, the new frontier is the food waste across the country. Some states have already passed laws about not allowing food scraps into landfills. And so what does that mean for you and me? Well, we are one of the most efficient ways of diverting food waste. If we can keep it on site at residents' homes, we are addressing a lot of the issues with food waste in this country. You might be composting for many, many different reasons. And there are probably more reasons to compost at home than what you even see here. But your reason for composting is going to be the most important when you go into setting up your system for your backyard composting. It's going to determine if you're going to do hot, active compost, or if you're going to do cold, passive compost. If you don't need the material right away, then you're probably not going to need to be so active at managing it come spring, summer, and fall. But if you're the person that's going to be utilizing this compost, you want to make sure that it is getting hot enough to actually cook, to actually use on your gardens, and actually utilize that material within the season if possible. We're going to look at two different systems in order to do that, if you will. It all comes down to temperature and how well you manage that pile. But it's going to give you all these benefits. Maybe you're doing this for diverting the food waste, so it's not going into the landfill and it helps improve the environment. But you're really not too worried about it going onto your finished garden or anything like that. You're just going to divert the food waste. That's what my dad does. He is a passive gardener. He doesn't use the compost in the end. It just collects, it decomposes, and it works for him very well. But there's all these reasons to compost if you're really looking even to use the material. It's going to improve your soil fertility. It's going to give you structure. So now you have better water holding capacity in your garden. There's money savings. So maybe you're going to you see there's now food diversion haulers that are picking up food scraps. And as laws get passed, people are going to have to manage their food scraps and probably increase pay to divert that material. Well, if we compost it in our own backyard, we don't have to pay for those hauling fees. All sorts of things here. And the Institute for Local Self-Reliance is a resource we use a lot. They're leaders in a lot of compost education and outreach. I love their materials. And they came up with this really nice food waste hierarchy to look at how do we address this issue of food waste in this country? And yes, the two top tiers are, can we be smarter when we're shopping to make sure those strawberries don't get shoved to the back of our refrigerator and then go bad? First, let's eat our food. Secondly, if we're not going to eat the food, are there people that are able to eat the food or have interest to do that? Can we divert that to people in need and donate it? Or is there a place where we can feed it to animals? Next is home composting. And that's where we are today. You really have a lot of power in managing your food scraps on that. And so I really love this graphic of giving us reasons why. All right, literally, let's dig in. What is compost? Compost, it is not dirt. And it is not soil. Compost is actually a soil amendment that you're going to be adding to your soil to improve the fertility of that, to improve the ability for plants to take up those nutrients and make them stronger. It will probably give you more water holding capacity. It can help with the texture of your soil. If you're really sandy, it's going to add more so you can hold that water in and it just doesn't drain out. If you have a lot of clay in your soil, it's going to allow you to give more composition to your soil to be better for plants as well. So it is a soil amendment that we're adding. So what it really does is we're going to actually mimic nature's process. So nature already composts all the time. Nature is decomposing. This is a process of decomposition. All you and I are going to be doing is creating a system where we're going to expedite nature's natural process of decomposition so we can utilize the material in the end. We're going to be adding things like maybe grass clippings, our food scraps, perhaps our leaves. And when you mix this all together in the right sort of what they say recipe, you end up with great soil amendment for that. And you're just creating nature's process of decomposition in a very mindful kind of system. The key to this, a lot of people, one of the questions that even came in your registration was, do I need to get worms or do I need to purchase worms? Not really. Worms are a macroorganism that is going to do decomposition. It's great to have worms in your bin, but they're not actually the total workhorses we're looking at here. Your workhorses for your compost bin is actually the microorganisms you can't even see. They're the ones that do the true decomposition work for you, and there's millions of them. And the more you have, the better this compost is going to work for you. And so these are the workhorses. These are who we want to keep happy. And you and I require the same thing for survival that these guys do. So if you think about it, okay, we have living organisms that are going to do work for my compost, and I need to keep them happy. Well, what keeps me happy is the same thing that keeps them happy. What they need is water, oxygen, food, and we're just going to call our compost pile the home, or a shelter for us, but a home for them. We need ideal conditions for them to do their work and work for us. So that is the 4 basic components of composting, and we're going to break it down for each of these to talk about what that means in a compost setting. But keep those microorganisms in mind, because that's really the ones going to be doing the work for us. Water, a lot of people ask about water, and how much water, how little, what happens when we get a ton of rain right now, especially with spring thaw. Our compost bins are usually pretty wet right now, and it's okay. Decomposers need this water to survive. How much water content are you looking for? And what composters and a lot of us use is that hand squeezing moisture test. It doesn't have to be very scientific. You literally can take a handful of your compost, maybe not dig through the fresh stuff. That might be a little bit tough, but get some stuff that's kind of partially in the middle of your pile. You can scrape away some of the top stuff and look at the center. What is it looking like? Grab a handful of that. If you squeeze it and you get droplets just around your fingers, that's good. It's about 40 to 60% moisture rate is what you're looking for in a compost bin. If it's dripping all the way down to your elbow, okay, you've got a little bit too high water content. You're going to start to get microorganisms that kind of drain out into the earth itself. And so they're not going to do the work for you as optimally. Does it mean that you have failed at composting? No, not at all. You're fine. It just means that you want to look at your compost and see, oh, if it's going to be raining in a couple days, maybe I want to put the lid or cover my compost one way or another. If it's too dry and you actually want more moisture in it, you can leave that lid off if it's going to rain, or actually water it with a hose. If there's not going to be rain coming up in the next couple of days, you can actually water your compost to make sure you're coming back up to that moisture level that you're looking for. That 40 to 60% is your target area for moisture. So I literally am watering my compost bin, especially in those dry months of August. If we're just not getting rain, might sound funny to you all, but I'm trying to get my compost process going. If you're a passive composter, you might not do that because you don't really care how fast it's decomposing. But if you really want that process, that decomposition and that soil amendment finished by the end of the season, then you really need to be looking at that and monitoring your compost bin. Next, we're going to talk about is oxygen. And oxygen is, we always think of a compost really stinking and smelling. There's a few reasons why that might be happening. And one of those reasons is, and a common reason, is there's just no oxygen in there. So we end up favoring the anaerobic microorganisms, the less desirable microorganisms that would be in the pile. And that means that there's no oxygen. And so those decomposers that thrive in a low oxygen or no oxygen environment, they're thriving. They don't really decompose very well. They're actually very slow at it. And they produce this sulfur smell that's really not desirable. And you will smell it sometimes, especially in the spring, so that we just have the unbalanced mix of material. What it typically means is we need to add in some dry material like leaves or some hay or straw, things like that. We'll get into that in just a minute. What you're trying to do is favor the aerobic decomposers. These are the microorganisms that really like oxygen. They need pockets of oxygen in there. So if it's too compact, you're not going to favor those aerobics. You need to get a pitchfork and mix that up so you're adding in some of that air material. I'll even put twigs in there, not thick sticks, but twigs to allow some air movement. And then you're going to really start seeing, you'll literally see your compost shrink in a matter of a day when you've got the ideal conditions and you've added that oxygen in, and it's got a really nice earthy smell to it. I love it. Not everybody loves that smell, but you know what I'm talking about, the earthy, nice smell of soil starting to really work for you. So if you're getting some smells into your compost, first of all, look to see if it's too compact or there's not enough oxygen getting to it is a good first step to think about. Food and nitrogen. When we look at compost, so now we're getting into the third component of a compost bin, and that's food. We have to feed our microorganisms, and they like green material and they like brown material. From a chemical standpoint, that's pretty much adding nitrogen and a good balance of carbon. Our food, our grass clippings, things that are really fresh, our coffee grounds, these are all fresh, what we call green material that's high in nitrogen. And this would be, like I said, your coffee grounds, your food scraps, your grass clippings, anything that's really fresh. It's usually quite wet, or it's just really fresh. I don't know how else to say that. It comes with a lot of high moisture, and the animals and the microorganisms really love this. But it does need to have a balance of carbon, because if we just have fresh material going in, you are going to get a lot of the smells. You are going to have more varmints and undesirable animals being attracted to your bin. And it creates a little bit more of need for troubleshooting, let's just say, or problems, if you will. So that's where we bring in brown material. Brown material actually will mix well with the fresh material. It gives the balance for those microorganisms to be able to have the air pockets they need and to really do that work. You're looking for, by weight, equal weight, fresh material to dry material. So those equal weights, if you think about it, fresh material is wet and heavy, and dry material is light and fluffy. You need almost 2 to 3 times more in volume of the brown material to mix with the wet material. The dry brown material, which is high in carbon, can be anything like leaves from your garden. If you saved enough from the fall and you have enough, that's great. But in the spring, we don't have as many leaves. You can use hay or straw. The composters out there have big debate between straw or hay. And you will talk to different people that prefer hay over straw or straw over hay. Both of them are a brown material that'll work in your garden. Hay does have more seeds, and so you're going to have more seeds to deal with in your compost. Straw has less seeds. It's more fiber-ish. And some people don't feel it breaks down as quickly, and it's more expensive. But I'm telling you, either one will work in order to bring that nice balanced material. So it could be just what you have available. Other items could be sawdust, if you have availability to sawdust. Sawdust can get dense in your compost, so you do need to be sure you're aerating it somehow if you're using a lot of sawdust. You can use bedding material. We have some forest products that are in my area that are locally sourced, and they're actually quite cheap for us for bedding material. And I'm literally talking about like an animal bedding, what I put in our chicken coop. That kind of bedding works really well in my compost. It's just It's just shredded wood and material, and not very thick. It's very, very nice material. So that works as well for your browns. We get a lot of questions about what not to compost. And this is a general rule. You will need to make the decision yourselves of how much you're willing to allow or not allow. So generally in backyard compost, we do not get our compost heated up high enough to be able to make sure their pathogens are pretty much cooked off from your compost. You need to get your compost pile up to over 160 degrees or so in order to be sure all pathogens are out. So when we add meats, bones, fat, dairy, and oils, those tend to be problem materials. First of all, they attract rodents and animals. They can be problems with some pathogens being introduced if you're not managing your compost. So you want to kind of keep those to a minimum. Now, if you had a salad at lunch and there's still dressing on it, that tends to be not a big deal or a problem. I'm not going to take a whole bottle of mayonnaise that no longer is good enough anymore and dump it in my compost though. So just that's kind of the distinction on that. So if your compost bin is not going to be a big, or if you're not gathering a lot of materials, then you want to keep these at bay. So not putting too much of this in, or none of it at all. Whole branches and logs, it's not that the logs or the branches are bad. It's just they don't break down in a backyard compost. They're just too thick. So use that in your backyard campfire or something. Logs and sticks, those or whole branches just won't break down. Dog or cat or human waste, you want to keep out of your backyard compost, especially if you're going to be using it on a garden. Now, for passive composters that are not going to put this on a garden, you can put your dog and cat waste in there if you would like. The cat kitty litter you have to be careful of, because not all kitty litters can you put in your backyard compost. You need to look at your litter to find out if it's approved for backyard compost. I tried it. It didn't really work for me. I was putting it aside and putting it in a different compost bin that I wasn't going to use on my garden anyway. And it just wasn't really working. I haven't had a great success with that. But if you are going to be composting your cat waste, do look at your kitty litter that you're using. So it's not just that clay or have additives of chemicals that are in there that might not work for your compost. Charcoal, and what I mean by charcoal is the whole chunks of charcoal. I see some questions coming in. I'll be addressing that just in a minute here. Charcoal is just too thick, and you have usually lighter fluid that's in it, and you don't want that kind of thing. Again, it's about the chemicals that are being added in. You don't want to put that in your compost. Treated wood, I say it, so a lot of people talk about treated wood because they make their compost using treated wood. You can do either or. You have to have a comfort. If you're going to use treated wood for building your compost, I don't recommend it, but it's not that it's going to be totally detrimental. Again, it comes down to how are you going to use the finished product of your compost? Is it going to go on a garden? How strict are you with organic gardening in your own backyard? There is chemicals that will leach out if you're using treated wood for building your compost pile or your compost. And that could leach in there, and you need to be mindful of that. That's pretty much what that is. And then persistent weeds. Backyard compost, it's really hard to get that temperature up high enough where you're going to kill those persistent weeds so they wouldn't germinate when you put it on a garden. We'll talk about temperature in a minute, but really your target for killing the germination of a tomato seed that was in from last year takes 150 degrees Fahrenheit for that pile to heat up to. Any weed seeds like this also need to get probably that target of 140 degrees. And so if you are putting any old seeds or some problem weeds in your compost, you need to know, is this going to heat up high enough to actually kill the seeds? Otherwise, you're just going to spread the weed seeds right back onto your garden and have to weed that In the state of Wisconsin, we are allowed to bag up any persistent weeds or invasive species of plants that are problem plants and put it into our garbage can. But typically yard material is not allowed in the compost. But when it comes to invasive species, those are baggable and you can put in the landfill. I'm going to just look at the chat real quick. Carol asks, is brown material necessarily dry? I have some damp oak leaves that are trapped in some hole. Yeah, that's no problem. So oak leaves are still, even when they're wet from the rain, they're considered a dry or a brown material for your compost, even if they're wet. So yes, that is still a brown material. And then could shredded paper be used as a brown material? Yes. So if you're using shredded paper, just be mindful of the ink, the ink level that you have on there. If it's real glossy paper, that glossy ink is going to go in your compost, so you want to avoid it. If it's just newspaper, that's no problem for your compost. So yeah, but both of those, yeah, good questions there about the brown materials. I also get a lot of questions about bedding and manure. Manure needs to be treated. So I do have backyard chickens. This is my lovely little lady here, and they are wonderful for my compost. But year one of having my backyard hens and cleaning out my coop at the beginning of spring, there was a lot of manure that was built up, but it all looked really like brown material with the bedding. It didn't look like it was all that soiled. So I took it all out and I put it in my backyard compost, and my compost heated up lovely in a day. And it was about 75 degrees, 80 degrees outside. And all of a sudden, an enormous stink came from my backyard compost. It was all that manure from, for the winter months that my hens were using that, or I didn't, in the winter, I get a little lazy with my chicken coop. So it wasn't cleaned out as much. And it really went anaerobic on me very fast. So I had to break that material up, break my pile up, spread it out. I brought in a bale of hay, spread that out, and really started adding brown material in with that manure. That manure needs to be treated sort of like a green material. It works very well in your backyard composts, but do be mindful that it's going to also heat that up. So you need a balanced material going in there when you do it. But the manure is perfect for getting your backyard piles up to that 140, 160 degrees. Just make sure the balance is equal. You will know because it will smell if it goes anaerobic on you for that. A question just came in. Can ash from barbecue be used in a compost bin if it's without lighter fluid? Just as long as you know what that ash is coming from. So if it was still from a charcoal, any charcoal, I'd be a little bit mindful about. If it's ash from wood that you were using in your barbecue, then you're probably fine, especially if you didn't use that lighter fluid. Just know what it's made of to be able to determine if it should go in your backyard compost. So that's the only thing you really need to be thinking about for the barbecues and you're using ash. What was its original form before it was burned? And then don't put chunks of it in. It's going to be treated. It won't break down as well. You might just still have chunks of wood that's going in. But yeah, it should be fine but be sure you know what it was when you started that barbecue and how it was treated. But if lighter fluid wasn't used, or if it's a pretty natural product, you're likely very fine with that. Okay. Next, we're going to talk about a home. One question that someone asked is, how do we do backyard composting affordably, like without, as low cost as possible? Literally, you would be composting if you had a pile in your backyard and you just added stuff to it. This is an example of that. As we see, it's cheap. There's nothing really wrong with this. There is composting happening. Unfortunately, there's not a lot. So if we do it this cheap and we don't make a home for it, you're going to end up with things like this. And it's wide open to any varmints that want to come in. It's going to attract them. It might not look very sightly to your neighbors, depending how closely you live to your neighbors. And it's a slow process because you see how it's going to be hard to get this pile to go up. So it's spread out a little bit. There's a lot of exposure to the environment. So it's only going to go as fast as you can create those conditions that are ideal for your microorganisms to do work for you. So a pile works. It's cheap, super easy, but it's probably not going to be as ideal for those workhorses that you're trying to get to do your work. So the next option is there are plans after plans after plans of building your own compost bin. And I have done this myself. I've used pallets quite often for building my compost. And these are, or you can use a wire system that you see here. It's cheap. It's usually upcycling stuff you have around or laying around or that you can get free or low cost. And you can definitely do this, especially if you're a little handy to do it, even creative, then definitely do that. It works great. And there's no problem with this. Most of these piles do not have much of a lid. So you could use a tarp. You could just make sure that you're covering it with hay or straw or some other brown material to make sure you're keeping any varmints out of it from smelling it from too far. And my first one really fell apart. You know, it was made of some wood, and over time it did degrade. My compost was starting to compost my structure. And that's fine. As long as you're a little handy and you're willing to do some of that, definitely take that on. There's no problem about it. And then as we're getting further into composting, you've got your pros of buying some of these compost bins. And many of you might have heard about Recycling Connections. We do sell this particular compost bin. We love this one. It is the home composter. It's not available in any stores. In fact, there's a funny long story to this, but we now sell them to communities to sell them to residents because we love this bin, and they no longer, the manufacturer doesn't distribute it, but we convince them to still let us get it out to people because we find it to be the best. Personally, in our office, all of us agree that any compost bin that's tied to the earth does better decomposition for you. And it should make a lot of sense. All of our workhorses are in the earth. We're trying to bring them up into a compost bin to actually do the decomposition for us. We are less excited about tumblers. Tumblers work. These are very nice. They look really nice. But when from a biological standpoint, they're gonna not do as good of a job for decomposition. Some of these have 2 compartments, some of them only have 1. So you're adding fresh material to this while you're trying to decompose and use the finished product, and it doesn't work as good. So those folks that really like the tumblers, there are people that love them. That's great. You just have to be more mindful about how you're managing the material because you're not getting the natural microorganisms coming up from the earth to do the work. So you can add some soil in there and you'll get the microorganisms going in there. So dig a hole, pick up some soil, throw it in there with your compost. You're at least getting the microorganisms start breaking down your material faster. These tend to break. There's pieces that break on these a little bit faster too. So their longevity is not as long, and they're the most expensive systems out there. So we tend to go with those that are tied to the earth, do it yourself kind of systems that work quite well for us. And that's just kind of personal preference that will come in. In the end, it's what's going to work for you and how you want to manage it. just be mindful, whatever system you pick, on how to manage that. So you're optimizing the conditions for those microorganisms. It all comes back to our decomposers. Placement for your compost bin. Should I put it in shade or should I put it in sun? Really, it doesn't matter. So if it's in the sun, you're going to have to perhaps add more moisture to it because it's going to dry out more. If you put it in the shade, it might get too wet and it just might not work as good for you. So it comes down to the moisture levels more than sunny or shady. So that's our experience with that one. Where you really want to place it, especially if you live in the northern states, is convenience. How convenient is it going to be for me to access it? You want it accessible, but not right up against the house. So where are you going to be able to convince your kids to take the compost out so it's not too much of a hassle? Think about how close it is also to your neighbors. You have to keep that in mind as well. Where are you going to use the finished product? Do you have to wheelbarrow it across your yard, or can you place it real close to your garden? Might want to think about that. Rule of thumb for varmints or little voles or mice that you might get in, you do want this about 2 feet away from any building if possible, so it's not directly up against your house. You might get a vole here or there in your system. And I don't have a problem with voles in my bin personally, but it's also not right up against my house. I don't have voles in my house, and mice for that thing. If you're worried about varmints like that, there are now screens, or you can make your own screen to put on the bottom of your compost bin, so they're not coming up from the earth for that. So if you don't like those macroorganisms like mice, or if you're in an area where there's rat problems, a screen on the bottom of your compost might be what would work for you. And that can be some chicken wire put on the bottom. There's other screen material you could put on. Some compost bins come with a screen that you can add or you can purchase to put on that fits right on the bin. So there you have that. The other thing I try to be mindful is how close it is to my fence, because remember, decomposers are breaking down material. If it's too close to a wooden fence, what do you think they're going to do? Yeah, they'll also look at your fibers and your wood and your fencing, and it will degrade your fence a little bit faster if you have a wooden fence there. So the process that some people ask what technique you use for composting. Obviously, you're just creating a pile and mixing it. Well, we tend to like the idea of lasagna. When you are adding material, you're layering it, especially when you're just gathering the fresh material and putting it into your bin. So starting off at the very bottom of your bin, you want to aerate that. So I put coarser material down at the bottom. So this springtime is a great time to do this because we have a lot of snags that have fallen during the winter. And so a lot of those build up in your yard, those thin sticks or little branches that you could take down, as long as they're not too thick of a branch, those work really well for putting at the bottom of your compost and then start building it up. Every time you add fresh material, you want to add some brown material after that. So have some hay, straw, shredded paper, some material you can put on there. I still have plenty of leaves from the fall, so I did a pretty good job of collecting my leaves. So I'm going to be covering it with leaves every time I add some green material to my bin. It also keeps the smell down. It keeps fruit flies in the middle of summer. We all know what that's like if you're a backyard composter. When it heats up and it's starting to get hot outside and we add fresh food scraps, if we don't cover that the next time we come out to put our food scraps in, it's like fruit fly city. And so if we added and we topped it off with brown material, you're going to have a lot less fruit fly problems or fly problems in the middle of the summer. And this just keeps that covering it down. It's not going to have those smells that can be really really problematic when you like open the compost lid to add more material and just have that smell. That's going to really squash it if you add enough of that brown material on top and keep that layering system going throughout. So the two types of composting, I've been talking about temperature quite a bit. I kind of talked about this passive cold composting and hot composting. For those of you who are wanting to compost for the fact of just diverting my food waste, but you're not really going to be utilizing it, you just feel good about the climate solution it brings in, or whatever your reason, you just don't want to mess with it. You're just not an active gardener. You just want to divert food waste. You're going to do pretty much the layer it and leave it strategy. So as you add food waste material, you're going to add browns on top. And as we go into spring and summer here, you're going to see your compost pile literally shrink. Some days you can even see it in a day's notice. Like it's amazing how fast that material breaks down, especially in the spring here. There's very low effort that you need to make. There usually is not a problem with our compost bins filling up in the spring and summer, because decomposition really speeds up. And sometimes we don't even produce enough of the food scraps in our own kitchen to like keep up with the decomposition happening in your backyard. So very low effort. You do not need to pay too much attention to this, because you really don't care if the compost dries out or it doesn't. You know, this is a passive composter. Kind of add stuff to it and leave it. And as long as it's working for you, you're composting, and that's it. And that is completely fine. You will not get finished product probably in that season, but for you, it doesn't matter because you're not needing that finished product. The one thing you need to watch, it's going to be colder. It's never going to really heat up to that 140 degrees that you want for breaking down any seed material, but it may not matter to you because you're not going to be putting this on a garden anyway. So that is cold composting. It's a passive approach to composting. It's still backyard composting, and a lot of people do this as their compost methods. There's no problem and no worries about that. If you are someone who's like, but I want the black gold, I want that goodness, my plants want that, I want that nutrient rich soil amendment, then you might be wanting to look at a little bit more active composting. If you're really active, you could have finished compost product within a month, really. If you're depending on the size of the pile and things like that, for me, it's usually a 3 to 6 month process for me, because I'm semi-active. I do monitor the temperature. So for hot active compost, I want that finished product. I wanted it about, the spring. I'm breaking down my compost bins, making a big old pile. I'm going to cover it, and then I'm going to let it kind of sit. And so by the time fall comes, I'm putting that material that I collected all in the spring, all of that's going to go in my garden for the rest going into winter. So I'm preparing my flower beds. So they all have soil amendment that was put right on top, that kind of composted for a good 3 to 6 months before it was put on. So I'm going into spring really ready to plant my plants in this garden. How I did that was, I do have more of a three compartment system. And that is for that reason, I don't want to keep putting fresh material on stuff that I'm like wanting to get into the curating process so I can use the material, because you just are keeping on adding fresh material. It's tough to be able to utilize that material. So that's why you see a lot of compost systems in a 2 or 3 bin system. This is a great picture of what that looks like. And I like this picture because it's even showing you the coloration that compost goes through in a really nice system. They're adding fresh material to this first compartment. The next compartment is they're not adding any more fresh material. They covered it with brown material, and this is going to keep all those insects and stuff like in the pile, so they're not going out. And it's what's called the beginning process of curing. You want to have 3 days straight where that temperature of the pile in the middle of the pile is at 150. And then, you know, it will even stop the germination of persistent weeds or of tomato plants that had the seeds in there. You're really looking for that. So you might want to invest in a compost thermometer. They're not that expensive. You can get it at any garden center. They're approximately $10 to $20. I did invest in one. Mine is 18, I think it's 18 or 24 inch long probe. So for backyard composters, you don't need the 3 or 4 inch probe unless you're getting into massive piles. But for backyard composter, an 18 to 24 inch probe composting thermometer works great. You're trying to get the internal temperature of that compost pile. So you're literally putting the probe in there and monitoring it. And you want to check to see if that temperature can stay up. You're probably good if it's hitting the 130, 140. You're going to get most of those seeds killed off, so they won't germinate for you. So if you don't get to the 150, you will be okay. Your compost will still be really nice and give you that black finished product in the end. But you want to keep that pile up for at least 3 days. And then the temperature of your compost is going to be, you know, you're going to ensure that the decomposition process is finished. Then after those 3 days, your pile's going to stay at a higher temperature, but it doesn't have to stay that high. It's going to start dropping really fast. And you actually see this after a pile is built. The first couple days of when I really build up my pile and I want it to cook for my 3 days, it's hot and it feels hot, and it does have a stronger smell. That earthy smell is a little bit more stronger for those 3 days. And all of a sudden, it just is, the temperature drops about 10 to 20 degrees, and it's now moving into a curating phase. And this curating phase lasts a couple weeks, maybe a month. Some people say six weeks is how you want to curate it. I think 3 weeks is fine if you're curating it before you utilize it, but you're still not going to have the finished gold product or that black gold product for a while. You'll want to just monitor that, but you're going to see that compost really change in color and get really beautiful, really nice smelling. And so this picture shows that very well of how that changes through the process itself. So you want it dark brown or black, crumbly, where you can't even recognize kind of leaves, grass, food scraps. Sorry, I always still end up with eggshells. Eggshells don't really break down. That's the calcium carbonate that it is made of, but it adds really nice texture to your compost pile. So it's not bad to have those eggshells in there. I think it works out really well. Adds those air pockets for those organisms too. So few things more talking about troubleshooting. So what happens? The rule of thumb is going to be the same for all of these problems. Let's say you have a rotten odor that comes from it, almost like a rotten egg smell. If you smell that coming from your compost bin, it's gone anaerobic, most likely. And you just have too much moisture in there. You need to break that compost up or add some brown material. So somehow get some air in there. Mix the brown material in with the compost. And then you're going to see in a day that is going to be almost immediately shifted. You are favoring more of those anaerobic organisms, and they're stinky. If you're smelling ammonia odor, again, you have too much greens, so add more brown material to it. Break it apart, get some air in there. Let's say your pile is too low in temperature, so your pile is just too small. It's might be too cold outside. You know, there's a number of things why the pile is just not hot. You just don't have enough materials. So you can do a few different things to do that. Just make a bigger pile, get some manure from a neighbor or a friend or farmer if they live near you. Get that pile up. You just need more material in there, and then you'll get cooking real well. If it's too high, break that pile up. You just have, it's just getting too hot. It needs more ventilation. You can reduce the size if that's the case. Usually backyard composting is not, that doesn't tend to be the problem. More, we're trying to get the temperature up. But animals, we talked about, same thing. Make sure you are covering any material. If you have persistent animals getting in your compost bin, you might need to make sure you have a lid that's secured on there. Or don't put in that fatty food material that attracts them. If you have rodents, if you have rats, we talked about that. You can get a screen for them, and just be watching what you're putting in there. Oh yeah, beforehand, I just put this up because these are the questions that came in. What's the best formula for composting? We talked about this. We recommend the layering. Brown, oh, I didn't talk about this. Coffee filters. Someone had the question of, is brown unbleached paper coffee filters fine in a bin? Absolutely, yes. That's what I use. I use brown coffee filters and it all goes in my compost. Do I need to buy worms? Nope, because your workhorses are actually microorganisms than macro, but worms are great. If you add worms to your bin, you'll be fine. But it's not needed at all unless you're doing inside vermicomposting. That's a totally other topic. We didn't, like I said, we weren't going to get too much into the winter months, but we do have a really nice tutorial online if you'd like to learn more about how to prepare your compost for winter. And continue to compost throughout the whole year. Nice tips there of what we recommend. If you, how do you make sure it doesn't smell? I think we addressed this quite well by covering it. Any of those troubleshooting things that come in. Someone did ask about ash from a brush fire. Is it good for a compost? And really, it's no problem. Any materials really not too big of a problem if it's not too much of it. You're trying to seek balance in a compost. And so as long as you have balance of all of your materials, like I don't care too much if a piece of meat gets put in because my kids didn't eat everything at the dinner table. I'm still scraping that all into the compost. And a piece here and there is not causing problems for me and my compost method, but I'm not going to put a whole T-bone steak that wasn't eaten at dinner into my compost pile. That's just going to be too much. It's not going to be handled well. We talked about vermins and critters. Someone had a great question. I'm so glad this came up. Jumping worms. Jumping worms are an invasive worm that now is in the United States. It's a problem in many states, all across from the East Coast, and it's moving across the country. These are worms that are just really changing the composition of soil. As long as your compost bin is getting up to 105 degrees, it is not an ideal condition for a jumping worm. So most backyard composters do not see jumping worms, or they do not attract jumping worms into your compost bin. So if you wanted to monitor that, make sure your bin does heat up every once in a while, and you're going to deter any of those invasive worms into your system. When is compost able to be added to your garden? To have compost tumbler, or are they consistently added to it? So this is debatable of when you add that finished product to your garden. My garden, when I added material in the fall onto my garden itself, it wasn't completely decomposed. But I know by the time I'm going to be planting in it in spring, it's really gone through that compost process. So it might not have fully curated, but because it was going to be sitting in the garden, it's going to finish that compost process in the end, and finish that whole heating and curing afterwards. So that, you're just wanting to make sure it's broken down enough so it makes the nutrients as most available to your plants as possible. What can be used in place of brown material? I think we talked quite well about that. So I think I answered all the questions or most of the questions that came in advance there. I see a few here that I'm just going to look at. Have you used compost mailer bags or compostable paper cups? No, not for the backyard compost. It's not recommended to use any of those manufactured products that say compostable. I steer away from them. Most of them could have some, in the manufacturing process, they might have waxes on them. Backyard compost is not an industrial facility. We do not heat up our compost bins high enough for some of those compostable anything. That being said, pizza boxes I rip up and I put in my backyard compost because cardboard is fine. And most pizza boxes, almost all pizza boxes, are what's called PFAS free. It's a chemical that is persistent in a real problem across the United States in our water system. And PFAS are used in all sorts of manufactured products. Our exposure to them is great. Pizza boxes don't typically have PFAS. There's not that chemical use. So I rip it up and put it in my compost bin. Anything that says, any product or single use product that says compostable, it's mostly for compost facilities. Backyard composting is not a facility or a medium or a high scale compost. It won't break down there. So for garden use, I heard crushing ground eggshells before adding to the compost for better nutrients. Yeah, I do recommend that. Absolutely. Like I said, I have a lot of eggshells in mine. I have backyard chickens, so we have lots of eggs. And it doesn't break down, but I do try to break up those eggshells, and it just adds nice texture to your soil too. So it's great for backyard composting. This is a little side note about the compost we recommend. We don't need to spend too much time on that. Where you can get them, because we do our sale. Many of you probably have heard of this. Places we do this bin is available in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Illinois, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and also Wyoming, a few communities, West Virginia maybe as well, and New Jersey. I forgot to add those two as new communities for us too. I am right at 7 o'clock. Sorry. I was hoping for more questions and discussion, but I get so excited about talking about compost. There's my contact information, a little bit more about Recycling Connections. We're a nonprofit and we just love compost. It is what we've been doing this since the 1990s, and we have done lots of workshops on it, and we just want you to be successful. You can always email us with your compost questions if you want. Our website has some resources as well. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and if people would like to have a discussion or anything like that, I'm happy to stay on to take questions or talk more dirt with people if you would like. Any questions out there? You can unmute yourself at this point if you prefer to ask instead of using the chat. That's up to you.